Why not Max Brown? Evaluating the Gators quarterback choices for 2023. Hey everybody, Will Miles here with Read and Reaction, back with another article that's up on the website, readandreaction.com. Thank you everybody for helping us out over there. If you want to help us out further, you can subscribe to readandreaction.com. You'll get emails in your inbox that let you know when we've got something new, whether it's YouTube or whether it's on the website. You can also like and subscribe here on the YouTube channel. Hit that little bell. It'll let you know when we've got a video here. And finally, we're doing a little something new over on our Patreon channel where I'm allowing people to ask questions, and then I'm giving sort of free form answers, sometimes with some data backup, sometimes just sort of free forming. Here's an example, a little 2-minute clip of what that looks like. Go ahead and check that out. The reason is, and this is a chart I'm going to throw up here on the video. The reason is because I've been charting since 1989, the yards per completion versus completion percentage. And what you can see is that basically from 1989 until about 2005, those went in opposite directions. And so what was happening is that completion percentage was going up, right? Quarterbacks were getting more and more and more accurate. But the way they were getting more accurate was they were starting to throw the ball shorter and shorter distances. Their yards per completion were going down. The completion percentage has continued to go up over the years, but what we've and typically with those things being sort of offset until 2005, you were making a sacrifice. If you tried to throw downfield, well, all of a sudden now you weren't able to necessarily, able to be as efficient as you wanted to be. Well, from 2005 to about 2016, the completion percentage went up, and then it kind of moved around a little bit. The yards per completion sort of went up, consistently over time. And so completion percentage kind of holding steady, yards per completion going up. This is the first time that those two things had not moved in opposite directions. I think a lot of this has to do with the proliferation of spread offenses. 2005, obviously, is the year before Urban Meyer takes over at Florida. It's the year before really the spread offenses come to Power 5 conferences. Those start proliferating through Power 5 conferences. And now all of a sudden with spread offenses, the completion percentage could go up, but the yards per completion could go up as well, because now you've got these guys out in space who can hit big plays. And then comes 2016. And from 2016 to 2021, the completion percentage just skyrocketed, and the yards per completion stayed almost the same. And this coincides with two things. It coincides with RPOs, so run pass options, and then it also coincides with targeting rules. And both of those things, I think, play a huge role in terms of you can now send the guy over the middle and he's not going to get destroyed because, look, I mean, targeting 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there were a lot of people getting ejected. It's a much rarer occurrence now because they're starting to coach away from that. The other thing is that RPOs, it's hard to deal with RPOs. You put linebackers in conflict, and all of a sudden the defense can't be right if the quarterback is running things appropriately. And so what we've seen is a giant skyrocketing in completion percentage, and the yards per completion is staying relatively the same. Last year is the first year that's really dialed back. And I think we need to look at this and wonder if it's a trend. It's just one data point, but you can see that one at the end where completion percentage came down significantly, but yards per completion came down too. And I think some of this is that defenses are starting to make an adjustment. They're getting they've now gotten those smaller guys at linebackers. These guys have all grown up in 7-on-7 type environments where they're playing against spread offenses all the time. And so what you're seeing is, I think we saw it at Georgia, and some of that may be luck in terms of who they recruited, but I think some of it might be purposeful, that the two tight end offense, where all of a sudden now you're not spreading things out, is going to come back in many ways because the linebackers are too small for that, and you're going to be able to take advantage of it. So again, if you're interested, you can go over to patreon.com/readandreaction. Check those out. I'm going to be doing those two or three of those a week, all off season long. And then certainly through the season, we'll have post-game wrap-ups right after the game, so you can get instant reactions, and then also content throughout the week. So with that, let's get to the article. Why not Max Brown? Evaluating the Gators quarterback choices for 2023. If you spent any time following Florida football over the past few months, you've probably heard pundits argue about whether Graham Mertz or Jack Miller should be the starting quarterback. After looking at their profiles, I'm left asking the question, why not Max Brown? Currently a redshirt freshman, Brown is pulling double duty, attending both spring practices for the football team and trying to crack the lineup as an outfielder for the Gators baseball team. Neither of those is a small feat by itself. Certainly, I understand that the baseball angle probably makes folks question Brown's ability to win the starting job at quarterback. After all, Ben Napier wouldn't let him play baseball if he was really considering him to be the starter, would he? I do think that thinking has some merit, but it also is missing a couple of key details. First, Brown was a star baseball player in high school who only played quarterback his junior and senior years. Baseball has pull for those who love it. Just ask Michael Jordan. And taking a season to figure out whether he can hack it at the college level is a way to scratch a competitive itch that just won't go away. But the second thing is that you want your quarterbacks to have unshakable confidence. What shows that more than trying to play two sports at a major collegiate level? I don't think it's a coincidence that Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders are two of the highest profile players to do that, and that they both played at football powerhouses. You need major skill to play both, but you also need some swagger. None of which says Brown is even going to get a chance to play football. He wasn't a heralded prospect out of high school, 3-star, 1,558th overall, and he didn't get any work last year. But considering what Florida has at the quarterback position thus far, I think it's probably worth Napier and company giving him a long, hard look. Graham Mertz. Ever since it was announced that Mertz was transferring to Gainesville, I've had people asking what I think of him. I certainly don't ignore the tape when I'm trying to evaluate a quarterback, but what I'm looking for in the tape is whether the player is a reflection of his stats or whether something else is going on that's keeping his stats down. In Mertz's case, I think it may be a little bit of both. There's no doubt that the Wisconsin offense over the past few years has been relatively uninventive. The quarterback spends a lot of time under center, and last year was often in second and third and long situations because the Badgers' running game wasn't that good. But if we're being honest, Mertz hasn't been very good over the past 3 seasons either. At this point, you likely know how much I believe in high school completion percentage, particularly in a player's senior year, translates to the college game. Mertz completed just north of 62% of his throws, both his junior and senior year of high school. That's pretty good. He also averaged 10.2 yards per attempt and had 51 touchdowns to 0 interceptions his senior year. Also pretty good. Based on an analysis of quarterbacks, though, that I did when Florida flipped Graydon Rashada, I would have expected Mertz to turn into a star about 25% of the time. Based on Mertz's numbers at Wisconsin, that didn't happen. If you take a look at this table, I know there's a lot of numbers, but I think it's important to present them in full context. Mertz was a below-average quarterback all 3 years as a starter at Wisconsin. Whether you use my yards above replacement, YAR, metric, or whether you look at a more traditional metric like QB rating, he was below average. In 2022, his YAR was 73rd out of 108 qualifying FBS quarterbacks, those who averaged more than 14 yards throws per game. He was 63rd out of 108th in quarterback rating. For frame of reference, Anthony Richardson's quarterback rating was only 4 points lower than Mertz. But I want you to zero in on the completion percentage. At its best, it was 61.1% in 2020 and has dropped every year until 2022. At this point, Mertz's completion percentage is 59.5%, or just slightly below what he showed in high school. So even if we grant that Mertz will take a major step forward and approximate his high school completion percentage by switching from Wisconsin's offense to Florida's, you're still looking at a very, very limited ceiling. You can see this by just looking at what an improvement would need to look like to really move the needle. If I asked you coming into this season, would you take 25 touchdowns and 5 interceptions from Mertz, but he was going to put up the exact same efficiency numbers, 13 yards per completion, 59.3% completions over around 300 throws, would you take it? Those stats would result in the QB rating of 148.4. Florida had a quarterback in 2018 who threw 322 passes, completed 58.4% of them, had 24 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, and a quarterback rating of 143.4. Felipe Franks won 10 games for the Gators that year, but I don't think anyone would say that was a stable year at quarterback for the Gators. So what if Mertz exceeds expectations? Again, with the 25 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, but this time keeping his 13 yards per completion with a 62.3% completion percentage, his highest in high school. That would raise his quarterback rating to 154.7, which would have been top 25 in the country last season. I would propose that kind of season is what we should expect would be the absolute ceiling for Mertz and would constitute a success. The problem is that Mertz gives nothing in the running game. And so if we project 41 carries for -7 yards, his average over 3 years at Wisconsin, his yard drops to negative 0.21. You may get above average production through the air, but when combined with his running ability, you end up just slightly below average. Jack Miller. Gator fans seem to have soured on Miller after his performance in the bowl game, but given how Kyle Trask looked in 2022 against Oklahoma, we probably shouldn't hold that against him too much. But that doesn't mean we should expect to see a huge jump in production from Miller either, given what we've seen in college thus far. I broke down Miller's profile before the season last year, and he delivered about what we should have expected. In high school, Miller completed 56.7% of his passes, with his highest completion percentage topping out at 59.1% his senior year. In college thus far, albeit in limited, only 36 reps, he's completed 55.6% of his throws, completing 59.1% of his throws last season. That suggests he's probably topping out as a 60% thrower when he becomes comfortable in the offense, given his track record in high school. The good thing about Miller is that in his limited throws, he has been more efficient than Mertz, averaging more than 14 yards per completion thus far in college. This holds from high school, as Miller averaged 16.9 yards per completion there compared to Mertz's 14.9. We should expect him to be able to go down the field a little bit more. But what that means is we can do the same exercise regarding Miller's ceiling that we did in the previous section with Mertz. Let's assume great decision making, 25 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, and that his 14 yards per completion carries through a full season. Then let's assume he exceeds where I think he'll land and completes 61% of his throws. That profile suggests a ceiling of a quarterback rating of 157.2, which is very good but not quite elite. But Miller is also more mobile than Mertz, having averaged 6.0 yards per rush in high school on 234 carries and having averaged 0.7 yards per rush in college. If we take that same 0.7 yards per rush average and spread it out over 41 carries like we did for Mertz, we get a YAR of 0.30, or an above average functional quarterback. However, if we split the difference between his high school production and college production, 3.3 yards per rush, over 41 carries, his YAR increases to 0.61. That suggests that while Mertz's ceiling is just slightly below average, Miller's ceiling is above average, but not quite a star. Max Brown. If you read the title, you're likely not surprised I'm high on Brown. It's easy to see why when we look at his high school throwing stats. He completed 71.6% of his throws and averaged 12.4 yards per attempt in high school with 68 touchdowns and 10 interceptions his junior and senior year. It's hard to complete 70% of your throws against air. Just go watch Anthony Richardson's combine performance. Brown did it 2 straight years while averaging 17.3 yards per completion, significantly higher numbers than either Mertz or Miller. I don't expect Brown to replicate a 70% completion rate in college. Quarterbacks who have that high of a completion percentage high school almost always regress downward, even Joe Burrow, at least when you combine 2018 and 2019. But it does say something about where we should expect him to land. In a scenario where he absolutely flops, we would expect a completion percentage of around 60% while averaging around 14 yards per completion. In this flop scenario, his decision-making is terrible, 15 touchdowns, 20 interceptions, but his other peripherals raise his quarterback rating to 133.7, so better than Mertz's career quarterback rating at Wisconsin. In a scenario where he plays average with a completion percentage of 62%, a touchdown interception ratio of 20-12, and still averages 14 yards per completion, his quarterback rating would rise to 148.9. And in a scenario where he plays well, 67% completions, 14 yards per attempt, 25 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, his QB rating would be 170.0. Because we have zero college tape to base any analysis on, the variance in Brown's play could be huge. The upside is that his floor is likely close to where you would expect Mertz or Miller to end up, and you've learned whether he's a long-term solution at the position along the way. But there's also more that tilts the statistics towards Brown's direction. He averaged 7.1 yards per rush in high school on 327 carries. You wouldn't expect him to ever average less than a yard per carry as a starter, which over 41 carries would put his YAR above average, 0.21, even in his worst-case scenario. But let's say he can average 3.0 yards per carry. In his best-case throwing scenario, this puts his YAR at 1.28, or just edging into the elite. Bryce Young had a YAR of 1.24 last season. Takeaway. I actually went into this exercise thinking I was going to be making the case for Brown over Mertz, but come away believing instead it should be Brown versus Miller. Miller has the statistical profile to suggest that he could end up having a very good season for the Gators. I just don't see that same thing for Mertz. Some folks might point towards Bo Nix transferring to Oregon as a case study for how to make that happen. After all, Nix had a relatively poor high school completion percentage, 57.8 for his career, that he replicated at Auburn, 59.4%, and then jumped to 71.9% at Oregon. I actually picked Oregon to make the playoff last year because I thought Nix would get better. Not that much better, but by getting out of the SEC. Mertz is coming into the Lions' den. Plus, Nix is way more mobile, 5.7 yards per rush last year. But if we're squinting at one of the best transfers in recent memory as the only rationale for why to believe in a current transfer, it's probably a bad sign. And that's where things really start to get interesting. Napier has brought in both Mertz and Miller's transfers and ostensibly has plans for one or both to be the starter. It probably doesn't look great to the next potential transfer if those guys were to spend most of 2023 on the bench. Combine that with the reality that Billy Napier needs some wins in 2023. Another 6-7 season is not going to be received well within the fan base, and I'm not sure he's going to feel comfortable going with a redshirt freshman, especially opening the season in Salt Lake City. But I just can't help going back to the exercise that I laid out above. Even in what I would consider a worst case scenario, Brown is going to be an above average quarterback. In a best case scenario, we're talking about him as an all SEC caliber player. If you really want big time wins and want to change the narrative, there's no better way than getting all SEC caliber play out of a quarterback. Combine that with what I said about the moxie needed to try to play two sports, and I wonder whether the safe pick isn't the one we all think it is. So that's my take on the quarterback position there at Florida. Obviously, I'm not expecting Max Brown to win the starting job. I think it's a battle between Graham Mertz and Jack Miller. I think most Gator fans think that's kind of an underwhelming battle, given what we've seen from Miller, and quite honestly, given what we've seen from Mertz. Look, I think it's possible that you catch lightning in a bottle and Graham Mertz plays really, really well. I just think that what the stats suggest is that the ceiling, even if you quote unquote catch lightning in a bottle, is going to be a functional offense with a quarterback who's consistent in the short game, who's going to miss some long throws, and who over the long haul might allow you to go 8-4, but isn't going to allow you to go 11-1. And, look, I get it. You need the wins. And so 8-4, I think most people right now would take that if you signed up for it because you got consistency at the quarterback position. The question I have is that the best thing long-term for the program? Because if it's close and if Max Brown is really performing on par with Miller and on par with Mertz, then you got to find out what you have. And this was always, it's funny. There wasn't a whole lot of high school tape on Kyle Trask, but he had a completion percentage very similar to Max Brown. Now he obviously played in Texas, and Texas is a little bit different division. He was playing behind De'Aaron King there, and King wound up being a major Division I college player. At the same time, not a lot of tape on Trask, but what you could see was the decision making. And I think you see some of the same thing with Brown. Brown can be a little bit hesitant in terms of getting the ball out sometimes, but again, he's only been playing the position for a couple of years, and that certainly I think is going to work against him, especially with the road game against Utah. I suspect that Graham Mertz is starting that game no matter what, unless there's another transfer who comes in after spring practices, just because when you go on the road, you want that guy who's got that level of experience, who's played on the road before. I mean, anybody who's played at Ohio State isn't going to be intimidated by being at Utah. But I go back to what are we really working on here? We need a quarterback with a high ceiling. We hope DJ Lagway's that guy. We had hoped Jaden Rashada was that guy. Max Brown was sort of an afterthought coming in the recruiting class last year, but now he's third on the depth chart, and I suspect is going to make his way up. I'd love to see him by the end of the year. I'd love to see what he has. I think that probably means Florida's had a relatively unsuccessful season if he's in their plan. But I think when you look at his profile and you say, look, what do you need at quarterback? You need a guy who makes solid decisions. You need a guy who's accurate. And usually at the high school and college level, the reason I think they track so well is because the completion percentage tracks so well is because the completion percentage is a proxy for decision making, that you don't have to make a perfect throw in high school and college because you're almost always going to have somebody open. You just got to make the right read. And so what this suggests to me is that Brown was making the right read in high school, and that he's going to have the ability to do that in college as well. Now, look, maybe baseball complicates things, but I want a guy who wants to go out there and play 9 different sports and wants to compete and wants to see what he can do and see how far he can push himself. I think that's a positive thing, not a negative thing. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of spring camp, what the buzz is on Brown as he comes out of spring camp and potentially out of fall camp as well. Once you've got those two under your wing, look, I mean, Brown has as much time in the program as Miller, and then has more time in the program than Mertz. So from a system perspective, he should be fully caught up to where those guys are. Now we're just talking about experience, and Miller doesn't have a whole lot of experience. So if you were going to go with Miller versus Brown, if that's what you thought it was, is it really an advantage to go with Miller? versus if you were going to go Mertz versus Brown or Mertz versus Miller. Well, now you got a guy with a significant experience jump. So anyway, again, thank you so much for your support. Like and subscribe to videos here on YouTube. Like I said, if you're interested in getting some of that Ask Me Anything extra content, go over to patreon.com/readingreaction, sign up over there. Thanks so much, and go Gators.